Thank you and welcome to today's SSP Early Career Subcommittee webinar. Everything you wanted to know about open access, but were afraid to ask. We are very pleased that you can join us today. My name is Rebecca Benner and I am Associate Publisher at the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and a member of the SSP Early Career Subcommittee. On behalf of SSP, I would like to thank our webinar sponsor, Jack Farrell and Associates, of our participants. This 1-hour session will be recorded and posted on the SSP website 60 days following today's broadcast. If you have questions for the panelists or experience technical issues during the webinar, please use the question box to the right of your screen. Questions will be compiled for the presenters at the end of the webinar, and please don't be afraid to ask those questions. I will be moderating today's session, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Celine Carey is an editorial director in the Medicine and Life Sciences Journals program at Springer Nature. She has worked in STM publishing since 2002 with roles in books and journals at several different publishers. She has a strong interest in portfolios and products that support open research principles, including transparency, reproducibility, and inclusivity. Lisa Hinchliffe is Professor Coordinator for Information Literacy Services and Instruction in the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is also an affiliate faculty member in the University School of Information Sciences. She is a chef in the Scholarly Kitchen and focuses on bringing a researcher-centric approach to considering issues in scholarly communications and publishing. Yasmin Lange holds a PhD in book history and has more than 10 years of experience in academic publishing. Since 2018, she is Chief Publishing Officer and member of the Management Board at Brill, a medium-sized humanities and social sciences publisher founded in 1683. Yasmin is board member of STM and ALPSP. She enjoys speaking at library and publishing conferences about the future of humanities and book publishing, open access, and the digital humanities. Thank you all for joining me to talk about this great topic. Open access is an area of intense activity and rapid development in publishing. This activity is creating uncertainty in our field and has the potential to drive change quickly as things develop. During this webinar, we will cover some fundamentals of open access, followed by a discussion of current developments, and concluding with a look to the future. So let's start with the definition of open access, and I'll ask this question of Celine. Open access simply means an article's free, right?
Right, end of webinar, no.
Yes.
No, open access really means more than free. It encompasses much more than that. But at sort of the most basic level, open access refers to work that's made permanently freely available to read immediately on publication. And how that work can be reused by a reader is outlined by a variety of different types of licenses. So this is the end user license, which is the Creative Commons licenses that you most typically see. And those end user licenses they vary greatly and can be more or less restrictive depending on the license.
Great, thank you. But what about those colors that we hear a lot about, the precious metals and gemstones associated with open access? They seem to represent different tiers. We have gold and green, diamond, among others. Celine, could you talk about what all of that signifies?
Yep, the various colors of OA, gold, green, platinum, and bronze, and diamond, I think I've seen, really just refer to variations on how open access is paid for and what versions are made available when. So really the two that you'll hear about the most are gold open access. And so gold open access is where the version of record of a paper is, again, permanently freely available immediately on publication on a journal's platform, on the journal website, or the publisher's platform, which are often one and the same. And it's made available through the payment of an APC, so an article processing charge. And that's either in a fully open access journal, so a journal where all of the content is open access, or in a hybrid journal where some portion of the content is still behind a subscription paywall, but there's a payment of an APC, it's made freely available. Then there's green open access, and this is different from gold in a number of ways. One, it's the early version of a work. So sometimes that may be the version that was submitted. Most often, it's a version that was accepted. So it's gone through peer review and it's been accepted by the journal, but not yet gone through the typesetting and formatting and all the bells and whistles that a publisher may add to it. And it's made freely available after some period of time. So you hear about embargo periods after the version of record has been published. And another key difference is that these versions, these accepted versions, the green versions, are often available via repositories. So someplace like PubMed Central, rather than through a journal site or publisher site. And I think the key difference is that there's typically not a payment for green open access versus gold, where there's a payment of an APC. And I think a lot of the discussion and complexity around the future of open access centers around these two approaches. There's not a consensus on what the future of open access will look like, gold or green, and there's not sort of one way to do it. There's a lot of variation by region or location. So for example, in the US, there's been much more interest in green open access, whereas in Europe, the institutions and funders there have been really strong advocates for gold open access.
Great, thank you. Lisa, is there anything you would like to add?
I think that one of the things we can say is that in the library world, which I kind of bring that perspective here, there's also questions of sort of, even if all these versions are available, which will be considered, if you will, an acceptable copy for a researcher who wants to cite that article, say in future scholarly work, and also around the preservation, right? So where do we focus our preservation efforts on making sure that there is, for the ages, like 100 years from now, can somebody get to that article, and which version of that article are we interested in being preserved? Typically, we're thinking more about the version of record, and so we're looking for that gold open access. But we're also thinking then about the one thing I would like to add that I build is the platinum or diamond OA journal, where Celine talked a lot about APCs, and that is the case for a lot of journals, that the funding is pay per article to publish. But we do have journals where they're subvented some other way. And so maybe there's a funder or an association or a university that pays for the cost of the journal. And so it's actually free to read and free to publish. And obviously for many authors, that would be very attractive. But these different business models start to underscore as well.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful information. So now we know the what, but what about the who? That is the stakeholders. In short, who cares? Yasmin, would you like to start and talk about authors and funders?
I notice I'm on mute. Wanted to be polite. Yeah, you could say who cares or who is the driving force behind open access. And authors are certainly, you could say, the most important group, but the question is, have they been in the past really the driving force, as maybe you would think they could be? But the relationship of authors with open access is kind of ambiguous. And to illustrate that, I would like to borrow the results of an author survey that was conducted by Taylor and Francis in 2019. In that survey, 88% of researchers said they support the principle of everyone having access to their research. So there is a strong sympathy there for open access. But when it comes to action for open access and knowledge about the topic, the figures in the survey look very differently. According to the survey, for example, use of self-archiving, what we've just talked about, green open access, is very low. 40% of researchers would not consider submitting to a full open access journals for various reasons. And 2/3 of respondents said they know nothing about major open access initiatives like Plan S or the Berlin Declaration of Open Access and other bigger topics that we publishers think are common knowledge. Also, open options are an important factor for researchers when they pick a journal, but other criteria like reputation, readership, and impact factor always score higher in author surveys, and also did in the Taylor and Francis author survey. So while researchers seem to be very sympathetic with open access, they haven't been the driving factor. It hasn't been the driving factor behind their publication behavior, and so they haven't been the driving force behind the open access movement. The driving force in the last few years have been some public and private funding bodies. We have seen that open access mandates have been sharpened in the last few years. There were more and more policies there, and that was mainly with the motto, the public pays, so also the public should have access to research. We will speak later in the webinar a bit more about Plan S and funding bodies. So I will leave it there and hand over to Celine, who will talk about the other stakeholders, the publishers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think publishers are a key stakeholder in the publication process. Publishers have been sort of traditionally the entities or the businesses that have managed the peer review process and oversee the publication process, the distribution, dissemination of research. And for a very long time, publishers had relied largely on subscription-based business models. So with the advent of open access, so making content available for free, that's obviously a disruption to a subscription model. So publishers are key stakeholders because publishers are seeking ways to address open access and ways to embrace open access, but in a way that's financially sustainable from a business perspective.
Great, thank you. And Lisa, what about librarians?
Well, I think publishers and then librarians are often in discussions these days, right, Celine, around the open access issues. So we see, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, the specific models later. So I'll just say in general, libraries are looking at taking on some institutional responsibility for managing the flow of payments to publishers when their affiliated scholars are publishing in an open access way. And so there's a lot of questions about how to do that, whether certain authors will welcome that management, especially those authors who have historically had their own funds from their granting agencies in order to pay those fees, often following on a mandate in the way that Yasmin was talking about. But the question here, about those fields that don't have grant funding, libraries are also looking at how do we create equity in that area so that we don't have STM information as open access because the funders have prioritized that, but then social sciences and humanities, and social sciences and humanities, I will point out, often have a very large general public readership when that information is available, are not able to publish open access because the funders are structuring the grants differently. And so I think librarians are kind of a force for equity in certain ways, and also attentive to the issues because, well, we are positioned to actually work with publishers because we are the campus units that have historically been purchasing content for reading. So we have relationships there that can be leveraged into, okay, how does this new world come into being? And then what does it look like once it's here?
Great, thank you. That's a nice segue to the next question because we've talked quite a bit about journals. And Yasmin, could you talk about what does open access look like for books?
Yes, sure. Open access, like journal articles and journals, book series, monographs, or edited volumes, or book chapters can be made available open access, usually against a fee. This fee is called book publication charge, so very similar to the APC. We use the abbreviation BPC. Most funding bodies, because we have already talked about mandates, most funding bodies currently do not mandate the publication of books in open access, but we see that some funding bodies are starting to experiment with that. We see a lot of funding bodies, like for example, the ERC, providing generous funds for making books available in open access. And we also see that in some countries, the research assessment, for example, in the UK, the research assessment exercise will take in the next round books which are published open access into consideration. When you look at the current market of open access books, you can take a glance at a platform which is called OAPEN. That's a platform that hosts a large number of open access books from quality publishers. This platform currently hosts 13,000 open access books in 50 different languages. So it is not just something that is an English language thing. And these books are published by more than 300 academic publishers. It's definitely not something exotic anymore, as it used to be maybe 5 or 10 years ago. The biggest players in open access books are, if you just look at the numbers, are Peter Lang, Springer, Taylor and Francis, Transcript, which is a German HSS publisher, Amsterdam University Press, Brill, the company where I work, and De Gruyter, which is a publisher based in Germany. As books play a much bigger role in the humanities and social sciences, it's quite logical that also open access books are bigger in these fields, where the publication of a book is still important for scholars to get tenure. Publishing in open access books, you can say, is easy on the one hand, but also challenging on the other hand. And why is it easy? It's easy because it is a one-time project. It is not like a journal. If you wanted to flip a journal which is subscription-based, it is difficult because a journal is recurring revenue. And if you flip it, you have to flip it for all eternity, so to say. And for some fields, as Lisa has already pointed out, it is very difficult to generate this APC income on a regular basis. But a book is fairly easy because you do one calculation, you make an offer for a publication fee, which pays for certain services, and you publish it, and then you're done. So for the publisher, it's an attractive thing to do, and also for the author who then can reach a much broader audience, actually the broadest audience possible. What is challenging, however, with open access books is the fact that academic books still generate a lot of print revenues. In the journal world, customers have more or less switched completely to online. But in the book world, this is much less the case. I don't know the exact ratio of print and online in book publishing overall, but for Brill, this would be around 70% of print revenue and 30% online revenue. So you're trying to switch something, you're trying to flip something, which is still something very physical. And I think that's also the print revenues, also the variety of print revenues that some publishers have is also one of the reasons why BPCs vary hugely between one publisher and the other. They range from, let's say, 4,000, 5,000 euros at the lowest level to going up to 20,000 euros at the highest level. There are also, of course, differences in services and differences in cost of a monograph. Every monograph is different. So, just think about image rights, for example. If you need to clear those for open access, good luck. But also the impact that if a publisher takes the print revenues into consideration when calculating the BPC, that makes a huge difference. So if they don't take it into consideration and, for example, publish it with a non-restrictive, very liberal CC BY license, the fee will be very high. If they take it into consideration, they can, of course, ask for a much lower fee. So if print revenues drop over time, and they do, and we see in the current pandemic that the transition to online is accelerated, If print revenues drop for monographs, then BPCs will go up. And then it's a question whether funding will be available to make more books in open access available.
Great, thank you so much for that discussion. So let's move to the how. Lisa and then Celine, how do we pay for open access?
So it's interesting because you might think open access is all about making things available and the great things that will happen because scholarship is accessible. And I think what we are showing here today is that a great part of the challenge of open access isn't making reading possible. It's actually figuring out how to fund the publication process. And also, you know, make sure that we have the kind of quality in production services that authors are looking for in their scholarship and that we want in the scholarly record, right? We want things to, you know, I was laughing a little bit at like the one and then you're done, because of course we do want that book to stay on that digital platform forever. So those,
True.
you know, it's the other issue of having to charge upfront for all future costs for a monograph is an interesting sort of thing to figure out, because you also don't have the recurring APC revenue you might have in a journal, right? So I was kind of puzzling that through. So, you know, libraries, so first of all, one thing we haven't mentioned, but I'm just going to toss in because I was thinking about this on books. You know, libraries themselves are becoming publishers in a number of cases, particularly our large research libraries and mid-sized university libraries in the US. So I know my own university library where I work, we have an imprint, the Illinois Open. We published 2 books out of the library this year. So obviously there's a model there of subventing the publication because there was no BPC either, right? So it was a free, but obviously it's very, very small scale, 2 books this year. And, you know, very good books, et cetera, but that's not a scale to what people are looking for. So when we look at scalability, again, we're coming back to where is the kind of funding in the system right now that pays for reading? And it's really the OA 2020 initiative that comes originally out of Germany. I've been listening to us and realizing what a force Germany has been for some of this openness. And other institutions have signed on as well around the world, actually saying, look, libraries already spend a lot with publishers. We should just redirect that, you know, rather than same publisher, but rather than spending it on reading, we're going to spend it on publishing. And their contention in the OA 2020 is that there's enough money in the system. You will hear this phrase a lot. There is enough money in the system. I'm not sure all of us believe that original analysis still holds true today, because the scholarly publishing industry is expanding. And so even if there was enough money at one point, it's not clear that there still is. But the other thing is, whenever you transition a system, there's higher costs in those years of transition, because you're having to invest in a new way of doing things, and while you're still maintaining parts of the old way. And so that's the time we're living in right now, which is the transition, which is definitely now going to be challenged by the pandemic impact on library budgets. But let's not go into that depressing topic yet. The biggest thing we're seeing libraries do are 2 kinds of agreements, and so much can be said about these, but I've written about it on the Scholarly Kitchen in both cases. Different models where libraries are investing. So I'm going to talk about a couple of them. First, the one we hear most is the transformative agreement, which is where bundling together reading and publishing services. This is things that we see, for example, Project Deal, again in Germany, but we see it happening all over the world. In those agreements, libraries redirect their subscription spend to subscription and publishing spend. The way that is distributed, the different machinations that show up in the contract, whether it's tokens, offsets, et cetera, that's a whole graduate level course in scholarly publishing models. So we won't get into it here, but the most important thing is you're redirecting that money with existing publishers. Now that's great if you work for, say, Springer Nature, where we had existing contracts. But there are publishers that have come on the scene since the rise of open access, like PLOS, for example. But the journal, there's a number of other OA only publishers. They have never published under a subscription model. So there's no existing subscription spend to redirect. And so they have been approached, a lot of them started just with that plain APC model that Celine mentioned earlier. But increasingly, we're seeing libraries, if they see that their scholars really publish with one place a lot, we're seeing what I have termed, so I'll give myself credit, but other people can call it something else, the pure publish agreement. Where there's no subscription to pay for, so you're paying for a pure publish. And we see PLOS has a number of these, JMR, MDPI, the pure publish publishers are increasingly looking to the library as a way of sort of firming up a contract for an institution that does a lot of publishing with them. Now, one of the questions we have to ask is, so where's the library getting that money? Because you weren't spending it with subscriptions before. So they may be cutting subscriptions, and we certainly see libraries cutting subscriptions. They may also be taking it from other parts of the budget, which is not good news for a publisher like Brill, because often what loses out in these cases is the monographic budget. So we're seeing some of that transition. The other models that we see are things like subscribe to open, where by continuing their subscriptions, there's sort of a collective impact that by everyone continuing to subscribe, the publisher will then fulfill those subscriptions, but also open the content for everyone else. Really complicated to think through, but and then, of course, there's a lot of other models out there that are sort of about this library subscription spend. And then we do see libraries just also offering up subvention funds. And there was a recent piece on Scholarly Kitchen from Virginia University that had this kind of subvention fund that they worked with. One of the things with a lot of these is that libraries are saying, but we're not so hot on paying for publishing gold OA articles in hybrid journals unless they are inside of a transformative agreement. And so libraries are basically developing policy in this area too that may or may not align with funder policies and may or may not align with government policies. Lots of policy complications. So Celine, I know Springer Nature has actually been like on the leading edge of trying to out this, including, with California's co-investment model where they want a transformative agreement, the library pays, but the researcher
pay a portion, yes.
So I'm gonna turn it over to the publisher perspective on this complexity.
Yeah, and I think you've got it exactly right, is that it is tremendously complicated because not only are there the different models that you've outlined, there's also differences among the publishers, just like the same way that I think we've talked about like the big deal, the big deal is not the same. The big deal at Elsevier is not the big deal at Springer Nature, is not the big deal at Wiley. They're all different. They have nuances of how they're put together, how much flexibility there is, all the rules and ins and outs. I think that's what we're seeing as well for the transformative agreements, read and publish, publish and read. They all have nuances to them among publishers, but then also at each deal level. I think at Springer Nature, the University of California deal is not the same as the German deal, is not the same as the other country deal. All of them have become sort of highly complex, highly negotiated, and all have different terms. And so I think if the attendees on this webinar are saying this is complicated, it's like, yes, because it is very complicated. I think we're looking at a more complex future. And I think, with thinking back on the stakeholders, I think one of the things that we all try to keep in mind is how are the researchers and authors navigating this? And I think that's one of the challenges we have in the future.
Great, thank you. Now, Celine, you talked about the APC model. Isn't that just vanity publishing or paying to publish?
So I think with the advent of open access, and with the APZ model being the first sort of business model that was set up behind open access. It was originally, the way it was originally talked about, 15, 20 years ago, it was thought of as an author pays model. And while that's somewhat true at a transactional level, an article is published, there are authors, they may be submitting an invoice somewhere. Just like Lisa talked about earlier, there's more to the story of who's actually paying. It's coming from, at this point, now that the APC is a fairly well-established model, there's grant funding set aside, institutions, department funds. So it's, though some authors do pay out of pocket, that's less the typical scenario. And so there's, less of a situation where an author is like, I'm going to pay and get myself published. And the reason for that, and I think it's the most important piece of it, and it's, almost separate from any discussion of business models or open access or subscription, is really that ensuring that there's good peer review practices in place and editorial standards and practices are being followed within a journal, if it's open access or not. I mean, that's really what's essential to maintaining the integrity of the publication process, maintaining the integrity of the scientific record.
Great, thank you. That's a nice segue that talking about integrity. Occasionally our editorial board members will forward emails they've received from a publisher asking them to submit their papers or serve on an editorial board of a journal whose title is strikingly similar to ours. And there definitely seems to be confusion. Is there a dark side to open access? And, for instance, what's this Beals list that we hear about? Yasmin or Lisa, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I can maybe start. I leave the Beals list to Lisa and to start with the dark side. I would say there is a dark side to academic publishing, and I wouldn't really put the blame on open access per se. Also, before we had open access, there were predatory publishers who had no proper peer review in place, who had no editorial services, who didn't curate the publications that they were receiving. They were just putting everything into a print journal and were hoping that some librarians wouldn't notice and just subscribe. So now what they're doing, they're cheating the other part of the academic community, which is the authors, who are dependent on publications and who maybe not always have the experience which journals they can trust and which journals are fake. So it's probably more easy these days to replicate the look and feel of a proper journal online, and you don't have to convince critical librarians. You get the money from the author. But I wouldn't say that this has necessarily to do with open access. It's unfortunately a fact that there are journals out there which are predatory, which are not real journals. And so, the only thing you can do is really educate researchers. And I think that the entire community, librarians and also publishers, are working together to make sure that researchers find the right venues for their publications. Well-known publisher brands are a good sign of trust, but there are also websites like Think, Check, Submit, which give a bit of guidance to authors who are unsure about the publications which are out there.
Thank you.
I got left with Beals list, so I'll take a stab at it. So Beals list is something we hear about, and certainly a quick Google search is going to bring up everything you ever wanted to know. But I think the point here is Jeffrey Beal was a librarian who actually coined the term predatory publisher in the OA world, looking specifically at the OA world, because while I'd agree with Jasmine that we had vanity publishers, predatory publishers before, I like that she said they had to pass the critical eye of the librarian. So when the librarian was paying for the subscriptions, you had a different kind of dynamic going on. This open access world, it's easier to spin up a website, right? We could do one this afternoon. And it's transactional, and especially in the original APC model. And so it can create temptations from different pressures that people have. But for me, the phrase I personally like is fraudulent as opposed to predatory. because I think fraudulent is something that we legally can understand. And in fact, as the OMEX publisher is understanding right now because of cases that are coming through the United States, $50 million judgment against them for fraudulent practices. So for me, the big issue is there honesty in what is being said? You pay us this money, you get this service in response. So, you know, if an author wants to publish in a journal that does not have peer review and pay a certain amount of money for it, I think that is the author's decision. The problem is if they've been told that there's going to be peer review, so they think they are paying for peer review and they're not. And so for me, fraudulent is the word that helps me sort of cut through, because journals are of different quality, right? So we don't want to say that everything has to be the highest quality or it's predatory, but this issue of fraudulent for me is key. So the other thing that, you know, scholars are just like, tell me what the good ones are. Like, I don't want to spend my time figuring this out. So think, check, submit is great, but Beall's list was this sort of shortcut where he said, well, here's the ones to be concerned about. And he said, don't publish there, right? So it's this black list. And then there's white lists, like these are ones we've investigated and they're good ones. I think the community has come to say that this is a little bit more complicated world than that. Beall's list was at the publisher level. And there's increasingly evidence that perhaps even within a portfolio of some of these publishers, they may have some very high quality journals and others that at least look to be skirting the edge. And so we're now seeing this sort of safe list, watch list language emerging, which I think is a little bit more towards sort of saying, make sure you truly understand what is being offered so that you're not feeling like you're getting a full-fledged service if you're actually only getting essentially an electronic printing press. If you want an electronic printing press because that's what you want, I think that's fine. We just should understand that you're not getting that full peer review, editorial review kind of checks that we expect when we come to look at the scholarly record. So that's Beall, but also we see these other lists now emerging. The other thing that's going to happen, I think, as libraries increasingly pay through transformative journals or APC funds, for example, you can see that there's many institutions in the United States and in other countries that have paid an APC to OMEX, and there are funding bodies, prestigious funding bodies that have paid APCs to OMEX. So as the monies shift from being paid by the authors to being paid by institutions, whether that's libraries or funders, we are going to have to grapple with that same question that we grappled with in the subscription world. But it's going to be a little trickier because we're going to be saying no to our authors in some cases. And that's going to be tricky to negotiate, but that is a different webinar.
Great, thank you. Well, this was great that we've covered these fundamentals, and thank you. So maybe let's spend a little bit of time now on some current developments and elephant in the room. So what in the world is Plan S? Yasmin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, to give you a kind of a Wikipedia definition, Plan S is an initiative for open access publishing, which was launched in 2018 by Coalition S. Coalition S is a consortium of national research agencies and funders from mainly European countries, or I think only European countries these days, 12 of them. The plan asks researchers who receive funding from these funders to publish their research articles right upon publication in open access to make them available right away. The idea is to start with this in 2021. Well, that's really the very brief summary of what Plan S stands for. What does the S stand for, you might ask yourself? Some people were speculating that the initiator of the plan, Robert Jan Smits, who was working at the European Research Council at the time in 2018, that he is the reason why the plan is called Plan S. But when you actually look in Wikipedia, it says that S stands for shock. And the Wikipedia article is very, very well edited. So I suppose whoever has initiated this plan also wanted us to really come to the conclusion that it says shock. And, to be fair, it has sent quite a shockwave through the academic community, there was a lot of discussion among publishers, of course. There was a lot of discussion among researchers as well. I think researchers have never been so drawn into open access as they have after this plan was published. And also librarians were discussing Plan S and the feasibility of it. Interestingly, in the reaction to Plan S, all of the organizations who published a statement basically agreed with the core idea of Plan S, that we need to accelerate the transition to open access. There needs to be more open access and it needs to go faster. We have had open access for more than 20 years. We want it now and we want it faster. But the discussion really came about the 10 principles of Plan S, really the content of Plan S, the means with how they wanted to achieve this was highly debated. And the most challenging idea was probably the fact that funders didn't want to provide funding anymore for hybrid publication. So if you want to publish an open access article in a hybrid journal, you could do that, but you wouldn't get any funding anymore for gold open access. So you could only do it if the journal, the hybrid journal, then allows you to deposit an author manuscript or an accepted manuscript or the version of record with a 0 months embargo in a repository, which more or less very few to no hybrid journals currently allow, particularly because they wanted to add the CC BY license to that version of the manuscript. So this is where a lot of discussion and debate arose, and also humanities publishers, society publishers, who do not really see that the APC model, the full open access journal, which was preferred by Plan S, is really a feasible model for the majority of the portfolio. They had a lot of criticism on the plan. The plan was subsequently softened and changed, and yeah, maybe don't know what Lisa wants to add, but maybe this is something that she could also discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that could be said about Plan S, so I feel like I'm just going to be like a footnote, read my things on the scholarly method. But I mean, I think the big thing is obviously it's having an impact. It's going to have an impact, but it's also rapidly evolving. And so it's very hard to know exactly what that impact is. So I wouldn't worry about it per se, but I'd certainly be attentive to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Celine, maybe you could speak a little bit to that because some of our webinar attendees probably work for like society publishers who are affected by Plan S. So what does that mean for those societies, and what changes can they anticipate in the future?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard to know exactly because there is so much change going on. And I think, well, it's tough to say this. It's really difficult to speak generally about what open access, what sort of this transformative future Plan S, what it means for society publishers, what it means for other, proprietary journals, for publishers, or if it'll be good or bad, or if there'll be winners or losers, or whatever the case may be. I think for societies that publish with that are partnered with some of the bigger commercial publishers, some of these transformative agreements, read and publish deals, could have benefits. It opens up more funding. It potentially opens up routes for compliance with Plan S or other things like that. So there could be a benefit there. But I think for those societies that have, multi-journal portfolios with some of the bigger publishers, what happens in the future will really depend, on a number of different factors. And I think going back to some of the things Yasmin was talking about with books, there's so many elements to it, looking at what's a journal's current mix of open access and hybrid, what's their current financial arrangement with their publisher, what's the allocation model right now for consortia, what's it going to be under a transformative deal, what's the subscription price or the APC rate, how much print is there, how much is tied up in print revenue, like, page charges or color charges or things like that. So there's not, it's really difficult to tie a line between open access and what that means in the end, because it's a really complex commercial transformation that's going on. And so I think for society journals, for publishers and their proprietary programs, I think it's just really being prepared that there is a shift in the traditional way of doing business and adapting to that change and really looking at it sort of with eyes open will put those journals in the best position.
Great. Thank you. It does seem like we may be in a period of acceleration of open access. Do you think we'll ever achieve full open access for journals and books? And if so, how quickly might this occur? Lisa, shall we start with you?
Sure. So, I mean, my quip here is that we already are in a time of full open access for journal articles. It's just what we're trying to do is be in a time of full open legal access for scholarly journals. So, the reality is that if you are willing to go on the black market, if you will, or the dark web, almost every scholarly journal article is available. So we're trying to look at legal means that also let scholars really work with this, because we haven't emphasized so much. But it's really more than reading, right? It's really the ability to reproduce, to share with your colleagues. It's the things that the CC licenses enable us to do, whether it's the most permissive CC BY or if some of the more restrictive, it still allows sharing in ways that the using an illicit copy does not. So books I think are a little bit harder for the materiality reasons that Jasmine talked about, but we shouldn't say she's the only one who can opine on open access for books, but I just feel like she's obviously the expert on this call, so.
Yeah, I mean, at Brill, we currently publish 5% of our front list in open access, and I think that's not too bad. We're one of the bigger open access book publishers. So you can see that the transition is really much slower, has been much slower, and that has to do with funding. That has to do also with mandates, of course. So if funders begin to put more emphasis on open access books and include that in their policies, then we will see also a faster transition there. The percentage will definitely increase. We have seen it increasing, almost doubling every year. And if it goes on like that, at some point we will be at 20, 25, 30% probably. But the one book is not the other. We've already talked about it. Books differ hugely in cost. The legal situation for books can be very different from a simple monograph with text only to a monograph which includes images, and also readership differs, and it might not always be in the interest of the author to make a book available in open access. Some authors who receive royalties and have publications which reach a very broad audience might prefer to have that book published in non-open access. So I think for really very sincere, specific research monographs and edited volumes, this is really a very, very good model, and it will increase dramatically in the next years. But we will see other types of books, handbooks, reference works, books for the general public, where the transition will be slower to non-existent. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Lisa and Celine, there's a question from our attendees I thought that might fit here really well. She's saying a criticism she's heard about the transformative agreements is that it would force curating the journals the academics at a university could publish in, and that this would push out the smaller publishing houses. Could you maybe speak to
that? So I think there is a lot of concern I think we have to have. Obviously, routes to publication that are paved are easier than ones that are rocky, to use a metaphor. And so it is clearly the case that if the institution is going to pay, it's sort of like one bump in the road you don't have to work over. So I think the real issue here is that with a large publisher, a large university like mine, the University of Illinois, we've got hundreds, maybe thousands of articles that are being published. I mean, I see the California numbers, for example, with Springer Nature, right? Thousands of articles. So you've got a bulk of articles to work with that sort of makes it worth it on both sides to come to this kind of agreement. With the smaller publishers, you might publish one article every 4 years with a small humanities publisher. You're not going to put a 3-year contract in place to cover a one APC. And so I think this is a concern. And so I do think there are projects that are looking at how, like the OA switchboard and some of these other infrastructural pieces that might allow payments to smaller publishers to flow more freely than they currently do with sort of this one-off invoicing and then the authors applying for the subvention fund in the library that just puts a lot of hurdles. It's not that you can't get past those hurdles, but they're hurdles. And a transformative agreement sort of puts a paved road in front of you as an author.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Celine, did you want to? Okay.
yeah, I agree with that, and I think there's always going to be, I think the challenge, you know, around the criticism or the challenge that's come up around transformative is very much along the lines of how the subscription deals or the big deals are negotiated. It's, you know, the bigger, you know, sort of the bigger publishers and the larger libraries can do this, but I think there will be an evolution and probably some, you know, real innovation in how to do these, you know, innovation in sales, innovations in access and payment models that we, you know, can look forward to that I think will benefit those smaller publishers and smaller institutions as well.
You know, and if I may say so, from the point of view of a smaller publisher, in the past it was also difficult to sell your single institutional subscription to a big university because they had spent all their money on the big deals. So the situation is really not very much different, just that now it is really the researcher who will be demanding from their university library, no matter whether they have a big deal or not, hey, I want to have the opportunity to publish in this journal, in this obscure small journal, because that's the most important journal in my field. And it is by coincidence published by this smaller publisher. So you know, I think we have in this community always respected the different fields and also the wishes of researchers. So, you know, yeah, I fully agree. There will be ways to facilitate that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So many of our attendees are earlier in their careers. Could each of you talk about what does all this mean for them and their professional futures? How do they prepare and adapt? Yasmin, start with you.
Well, I think open access is a big changer in our industry, but I don't think it is the biggest. I think the biggest changer in our industry has been technology. And in a way, publishing has always been a very technology-driven, service-oriented people business. So if you have that interest in technology, and you know, in the past it was probably more the printing press, and now it is XML standards and platforms and workflows and processes and data streams and stuff like that. If you have that interest, that's positive and that will help you. You should have a good business acumen. You should have a love for the academic community, and preferably also a passion for the field where you're publishing in. If you have that, then I think it will help you from the start of your career, just as being able to adapt to a constantly changing work environment, because that has always been the case, and that will also be the case in the future in academic publishing. Whether this future is open or subscription based, that really doesn't matter.
Lisa or Celine, any thoughts about our attendees and what this all means for their professional futures?
I think the key thing was being really adaptable and understanding we're in a period of considerable change, and I think it will continue to be complex. It'll be potentially volatile. And so I think anyone in publishing careers is sort of, building up that adaptability, building up that resilience to change, and sort of embracing it is probably the best advice I could give.
So I think one of the things that I would add to this that we haven't talked as much about, like the whole reason we're doing all this open access, right, is for access to this information. And, as a librarian, our whole profession was created to make sure that there was common access to content. And that was at that time envisioned by like, okay, we'll buy a copy and we'll put it in a room and everyone's allowed to come to that room. And, the open access world actually enables us to think about the world being our room. And so, open access, I think, is definitely challenging us on the business model side, but it's also creating some opportunities for us to potentially address some of the inequities that our historic system had, which was has and have-nots on reading. And, the only other thing that we haven't brought out that I guess I think we have to think about a lot, and I know everyone on this webinar is thinking about, is how do we not create haves and have-nots for who gets to publish?
Yeah.
Right. And so that is the other exciting opportunity, I think, if we can figure out models that work, that also enable. So I think the other thing is, for better or for worse, this conversation has been sort of global north, to use the phrase, centric. And we should also really look to our colleagues who have done amazing things with different models in Latin and South America, where there's a very different approach to subventing this and a much broader no pay to publish, no pay to read, because there's a central funding model. And we're seeing that emerge in some African countries and in India and Asian countries as well. So I think it behooves us as well to be really reflective and not think that, the ways we have done it in the West and the North are the only ways we might go forward in the future, and to really think about places that haven't had that historic approach of this subscription model, what they have done because they've been freed to think in other ways, and how we might learn from that as well.
Great, thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion. We have just a few minutes left for any Q&A. There is one question, which is a good question, that we have remaining. What is the best resource to learn of up-to-date news on open access and Plan S?
Well, and Plan S, I think, makes it a little trickier, but I mean, maybe I'll share. So first of all, obviously, I think the Scholarly Kitchen is a must-read daily to your inbox. Not everything's on open access, but on scholarly communications and publishing generally. I think that Plan S itself or Coalition S, I should say, is offering a number of very interesting webinars that are worth listening to, and they've recorded many of them, and so you can easily listen to them. So I would encourage that as well. The OA 2020 initiative is also sponsoring a number of webinars recently, especially around transformative agreements. With the ESAC or ESAC website, I'm not getting the acronym right in my head, but so there's so many opportunities. So from my perspective, those would be the leading places that I look to for this information.
Yeah, I always enjoy newsletters from funding bodies. That's what I read a lot. And when it comes to conferences, there is once a year, there is the conference organized by OASPA, which is a big association of open access publishers and other stakeholders in the community. And that's certainly worth attending this year. It will be virtually. So hopefully more people can enjoy the webinars and discussions.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think I don't see any other questions from our attendees, so I think this brings us to the end just in time. So I would like to thank you all for your participation in today's SSP webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers for their time and engaging presentations, and thanks again to our sponsor, Jack Farrell and Associates. You will receive a webinar evaluation via email, and we encourage you to provide feedback and to help us determine topics for future webinars. Also, don't miss the next couple events on the SSP calendar. including the future preprints, coronavirus as a case study on September 22nd, as well as our New Direction seminar on September 30th and October 1st. Today's webinar was recorded and all registrants will be sent a link to the recording when it is posted on the SSP website. This concludes our session today.
Thank you.
Thank you.